So this evening we are looking at Johannes Vermeer's A Young Woman Standing at a Virginal, painted in around 1670 to 72, right at the end of Vermeer's life. So Vermeer's dates are 1632 to 1675. So this is really at the absolute peak of his maturity as an artist. And this first image is, as always, the painting as an object. Unfortunately, this is just a snap of the painting in the gallery. We don't have a label or anything to give us any sense of scale. But the painting's roughly half a meter high, so that gives you a sense of how big it is. And Vermeer tends to, particularly in his later career, tends to paint on this kind of smaller scale. It is on canvas, it's not a panel painting, which often you find for smaller paintings. It is a canvas painting, but he does tend to paint on a smaller scale. And he tends to paint these genre or interior scenes of everyday life. And usually they feature a lady in the composition, often engaged in some sort of domestic activity. We are looking at a woman who is standing right in the center of the composition, and she has got her hands on, or we would like to imagine she is playing what's called a musela, or a sort of harpsichord or virginal. And these were very expensive objects, usually reserved for the sort of higher social classes, for the wealthy classes. And she is looking out at us. She's engaging us into the painting as if she's almost kind of been interrupted. She's sort of looking out at the viewer. So we're drawn in not only to admire her in her wonderful finery, but also to look at the objects, the quite curious objects in the room. So we have two paintings on the back wall, this glorious light coming in from these glass paneled windows on the left of the composition. We have a beautiful marble tiled floor, and then there's this chair in the foreground, this lone chair, empty chair, which again is giving us, as we've seen in previous sessions, this sense, the way in which it's positioned and angled, it gives us this real sense of kind of creating a 360-degree kind of an all-round space within this tiny little window of life, this small interior. Vermeer is famous because he's only, there are only around 35, one of the reasons he's famous is because there are only around 35 extant works. So he has a very small oeuvre, and this is very unusual for a master of such talent and fame. And the reason for this is he had a very considered technique. A lot of thought goes into his paintings. As I say, his mature period really was the period in which he succeeded. We know very little about his sort of early life, but he was painting for a very small group of patrons, and they often amassed a huge number of works for themselves. So we know that 20 years after Vermeer's death, there was one patron that actually owned 21 of his paintings. So he was working for a very small environment in a very small town. He was from Delft, in the Dutch Republic, as it was known then, we don't really know much about his traveling in his early career, but we know that he was pretty much based in Delft certainly for the later years of his career, working for this small group of patrons. He was born, as I say, in 1632 in Delft. And he was born to quite a sort of a comfortable family. His father was a weaver. In the 1640s, they purchased an inn and a home on the marketplace in Delft. And in 1653, Vermeer, we know he marries a Catholic lady, and later he later converts to Catholicism, having been a Protestant himself. And in 1653, he is also admitted to the Guild of St. Luke, the Artists' Guild in Delft. And I think Vermeer is particularly celebrated for firstly his light, which we're going to look at, and you can see that in this painting. Firstly, the sort of light coming in through the window, and when we look closely, we'll be able to see that in more detail. But also his kind of harmony and ordering of objects within a composition, in order to convey a sort of ambiguous meaning. And I think that's why they're so engaging, is because a lot of his paintings have little symbols in them that kind of lead us to thinking that they could mean one thing or another. And we'll see that when we explore this painting. So I think what's important to as I say, to kind of think about when looking at paintings by Vermeer is this very considered working process. As I say, he puts a lot of thought not only into the meaning of his paintings, but clearly he was, almost a bit like Leonardo, very small output, but incredibly sort of premeditated, and very carefully conceived, not only in meaning, but also in execution. And I think to start with, as I say, looking at this better image, the use of light coming in through this window, it's very different to a light that we've seen previously with works by Caravaggio, for example, or even Rembrandt last week. We have quite a kind of cold blue light, and this is cast onto the back wall, which is, as I say, this sort of greyish, bluish white wall. And interestingly, his technique shows that he painted a ground, which is the sort of base layer of paint on which you build your kind of your chromatic composition. You build your glazes and your oils on top of this kind of base layer. I'm sure there are artists among you, I know Emily's watching, that would be able to explain this far better than me. But you can see that this grey ground on the back wall here, very much coming through, and it gives this kind of sense of a kind of cold interior. And actually, if you note the sort of luminosity of the window where my mouse is, of the wall where my mouse is, and actually if you were to pick that up and place it here, you really have a much darker part of the wall, and equally sort of here. So he's really kind of taking time to show this grading of light as it enters and floods into this space. And these are things we really take for granted when we look at works by Vermeer, but every kind of square, every tiny centimeter square needs to be looked at, because so much thought and detail has gone into it. And another aspect that we can see often in paintings by Vermeer are these double shadows. Now, you can see this being cast here. You can see a particular favorite detail of mine in this painting, and this is actually quite a good image. I've got terribly cold hands, so I'm having to do my zooming with both fingers, both hands. You need to keep moving. So you can see this double shadow here on the side of this frame, which I love that detail, because you can see the painting is kind of leaning forward, and giving this sort of sense of a shadow being cast very harshly from the left-hand side. And another amazing feature is the inside, this blue, this stripe, this very abstract stripe of blue, kind of whitish blue, that he wipes all the way down the inside of that ebony frame to give us a sense of the kind of that sort of luminosity that kind of is emitted from ebony or a dark shiny substance when light is shone on it. But he renders it in this kind of very crude strip of blue paint. And of course, we have this double shadow here as well. I think another thing to note, I'm going to go back to this frame here, is also how he just picks up the light, how the light picks up detailing and textures in the painting. This is a particular favorite. This is probably one of my favorite details in the whole of the National Gallery, this lone picture, which happens to be the only object in the whole composition that does not overlap with anything else. And we can see how he's picked up the light catching this sort of French style gilded frame, but just with very kind of, when we get up close, very sort of loose, just dots of paint in sort of white and yellow, or a sort of ochre yellow color. And here you can see how it bleeds into how the color, the undulations of the frame kind of bleed into one another because they've been caught so strongly by the light. Whereas here on this side, you very much see the frame in darkness. When I pull out here, you can see now how that really is the only feature in the composition that stands alone. Even the lady is kind of overlapping with the harpsichord and the pitch behind her. But the light in the frame very much is picking up also the light that catches this astonishingly rendered a dress, this beautiful sort of satin. It's actually called a tabard. It's this kind of columnar skirt, and then it has a tabard slift, I think, probably not pronouncing that right, here, which is this sort of boned, you can see the boning here, very uncomfortable formal wear. So this lady isn't just going about her daily chores. She's certainly dressed up for an occasion. She's got these wonderful, again, the sort of dots here, these kind of modular dots on the sleeve, this amazingly sort of puffy sleeve, really picking up, again, the dots of the pearl necklace, the light catching her hair and her the decoration she wears in her hair, and then of course echoing that in the frame on the back wall there. Even the sort of the studding on the chair in the foreground, you have this kind of continual conversation throughout the composition. So what are we looking at? I mean, we've appreciated the light in the picture. Her face is shrouded in shadow. What is going on? I mean, if anyone has any ideas, do unmute yourself and shout them out. I mean, she feels, for me, she feels kind of almost interrupted. She's in the middle of playing her harpsichord. She's sort of giving us a kind of, someone's entered her space. She has a knowing look. It's not a sort of frightened or vulnerable. She's got this kind of quite poised, confident look. She's looking out to the viewer. But she certainly sort of appears to be kind of waiting or anticipating someone or something. And that's very much kind of given away, I think, by this empty chair in the foreground. It's such a protagonist, and the ultramarine paint is picked up in her dress. You know, it's something we really sort of, our attention is very much drawn to. And ultramarine paint is, of course, a very expensive pigment. We don't know whether this was a commission, this painting, or not. But usually if you're using expensive pigments, it's something that's being paid for in advance, as it were. But using ultramarine paint in this chair, you know, we're really meant to be looking at it. Now, there are a couple of clues in this painting that may hint to the meaning. Now, the first is standing right behind her, raising his hand and holding this sort of tablet or card up in the air. And that is Cupid in a painting depicted, as I say, just above her, just behind, on the wall behind her. So all these pictures kind of crammed into the space, clearly wanting to convey and tell us something. And in paintings by Vermeer, you often get these paintings within paintings which do have meaning to them. Now, music was often an environment in which young sort of young lovers were kind of caught one another. It was a social occasion. It was very common playing music in 17th century in Holland. It was a very social activity. And the Cupid in the painting behind gives us a sense that she may be waiting for a lover, for someone that she is courting. She's dressed in all her finery and her jewelry, and this empty chair is perhaps a kind of a sign of this sort of expectant person, of waiting for this person, this expectant chair waiting for this person. Are we that person? You know, we're being looked at. Are we the person she's expecting to arrive into the space? Now, the meaning goes deeper, because the Cupid who's standing holding this tablet with his bow and arrow, or his bow in his right hand, This is, in fact, a painting that actually comes up in several of Vermeer's works. And it is after a book of emblems that was published in 1608 by a very famous Flemish artist called Otto van Veen, who was, in fact, if anyone came to the Rubens session, he was the teacher, one of Rubens's teachers. Rubens trained with him for 4 years. This composition has been traced to an emblem of Cupid holding up the card, and he says, I've written this down, and it says, "A lover ought to love only one." Now, this would very much make sense in the scene. There is a chair for one other, and this lady is bathed in kind of luminous daylight, and she looks incredibly virtuous. She's playing her instrument. Everything's very ordered. There's a very strong sense of harmony and calm. And in fact, interestingly, the painting itself, not just the composition or the sort of emblem of the Cupid holding up the tablet, but the painting itself is in fact after a version of this emblem, a painting of this emblem, stay with me, by an artist called Cesar van Everdingen. And it, as I say, appears in a couple of Vermeer's paintings. And there is in 1676, in the inventory of Vermeer's widow, so after Vermeer's died in 75, there's an inventory of his belongings, and it discusses, or it mentions, a Cupid hanging in the room next to his studio. So there are all these links, and it would, as we saw with Rembrandt, it would be very common for artists to incorporate objects that they owned or that they could borrow. Probably in the case of the harpsichord here was a borrowed object to reproduce them in their paintings. Another point on love is that, as I said earlier, Vermeer was a master of perspective, and it has been theorized that he was one of the sort of early users of the camera obscura, which was the kind of, I guess, the first version of the mechanical cameras we know it today, where there was a sort of pinhole in a box, and the light that entered the box, in fact, reflected the scene outside, but kind of inverted upside down. And this was a way in which artists could, in fact, trace, or, by putting a mirror there to invert the image, they could trace the reflection to create the perfect perspective of the view that they wanted to create. For example, Canaletto was a great advocate of the camera obscura, and there is a theory that Vermeer was using the camera obscura. But interestingly, in many of his paintings, and in this one, which we can see if we zoom in here, I think we can see, I'm not a conservator, so I'm not quite sure. And it might not be this, because there have been several kind of restorations that have taken place, I think, with this painting. But here, it's somewhere in this vicinity, and that for me feels like it's been a kind of disturbed area of the support. And I think that is a pinhole. There's definitely a pinhole. So if anyone can find anything that looks more like a pinhole than that, let me know. But that's a pinhole in which he would have put and a number of pinholes are found in Vermeer's paintings. He would have put a pin in the sort of at the vanishing point. So that is the point at which all of the orthogonal lines meet. The pin would have been attached to several pieces of string, and that would have been how he would have created his one-point perspective, which is I think, fascinating. So interestingly, the single-point perspective ends at her kind of chest or on her heart, which again is just, I think, too good to be a coincidence. So kind of really, not only is she at the heart of the composition, but she is kind of, her heart is at the center of the meaning of this composition. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and thank you very much for joining. But do, as I say, unmute. I'll stay on for a minute or two. So if anyone has any questions, please do ask. But otherwise, do have a look at the website, and yeah, look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks.